the topic is necessarily a little bit wider than anti-Semitism, because you can't get to the anti-Semitism problems without going through the issues around Israel. And I'm going to be very careful about the definitions there and the boundary between being critical of Israel and being anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, not thinking Israel should exist, and being anti-Semitic, being against Jewish people, and how one can lead you into the other, but they don't necessarily have to lead into each other. And I want to be absolutely clear that there are people inside the Labour Party and outside it who are extremely critical of Israel, but they manage to do it in ways which are never anti-Semitic and which always respect the feelings and beliefs and connections and culture of Jewish people. I'll give you a practical example, because you might be saying, well, what does that look like? Lisa Nandy is a good example, Labour MP, who is extremely involved in the Labour Friends of Palestine and the Middle East. I would say she's one of their leading figures in Parliament. She asks questions in Parliament that are extremely uncomfortable, both for Friends of Israel and, I imagine, for if the embassy is looking at it, they wouldn't be happy about the kind of probing questions that she's asking. But she never goes anywhere near anything that's anti-Semitic, and indeed when there was the debate about 3 weeks ago, I think it was, about anti-Semitism in British politics, she gave an extremely helpful and constructive speech about the need for the Labour Party to root out anti-Semitism from its ranks. Another example would be Ben Bradshaw, who's a Labour MP, former cabinet minister, very, very critical of Israel, again very heavily involved in the Labour Friends of Palestine, but I don't think anyone from the Jewish community has ever heard him phrase any of that or do any of it in a way that appears aimed at or prejudicial towards the community. So it is possible to engage in a debate about Israel from a critical point of view and not to indulge in anti-Semitism, which makes it even more depressing when people do blur the two and either express criticism of Israel in an anti-Semitic way, or just come out with other anti-Semitic stuff in politics that is sometimes nothing to do with Israel. I'll get on to that in a moment. I apologise that this is necessarily going to be quite a depressing subject matter. It's depressing for people from the Jewish community in the audience. It's depressing for other Friends of Israel in the audience. It's incredibly depressing for me as someone whose life has really revolved around the Labour Party, but who cares intensely about Israel. And I sometimes feel I'm at the middle of a bit of the Venn diagram. And my day job is director of We Believe in Israel, the grassroots part of BICOM, and outside of work, I'm very, very active in the Labour Party. I was a councillor for 12 years. I've stood for Parliament twice. I've served on the Labour Party National Executive. I'll be trying to get re-elected to the Labour Party National Executive this year. So I'm not someone that is kind of used to be involved in the Labour Party. I'm as involved as it's possible to be. So I want to start by, I don't want to pretend that any problems started with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader. I think that that's a simplistic way of looking at things. I think there's a background that's not to do with anti-Semitism, but it's to do with a moving apart of the views of the Jewish community on Israel, where 93% of the community, according to the most recent polling that was done, feel a deep connection to Israel, and the views of large portions of the Labour Party. There are two big triggers to that, both of which are conflicts in the Middle East. So One of them is 1967, the Six-Day War, where the perception of Israel in the West, particularly on the left, switched from it being from being this small state founded by Holocaust survivors, kind of it surrounded by powerful armies, defending itself, to suddenly it acquires lots of territory, it is occupying areas where there's large numbers of Palestinians living, and the Western perception is that Israel suddenly is a regional Goliath. Pre-1967, if you look at the internal politics of the Labour Party, it's actually the most radical and left-wing people in the Labour Party that were pro-Israel. It's people like Nye Bevan who are pushing a pro-Zionist position, a pro-Israel position. I'm using Zionist not to imply any policy stance towards everything that Israel does. A Zionist, in my definition, is just someone who believes that the Jewish people have got a right to self-determination and a right to their own state. But that was a left attitude in the Labour Party. Israel was seen as a kind of left-wing experiment with the kibbutzim and the moshavim and the very powerful Histrodot trade union movement. And more right-wing figures in the Labour... There was a problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party at the point of the foundation of the State of Israel. That didn't come from the left, it came from people who, on every other issue, someone like me from the centrist, or whatever wing you want to call it, the kind of non-Corbyn wing of the Labour Party. On every other issue, I would look at someone like Ernie Bevin, the guy who was Attlee's foreign secretary. When he founded NATO, that kind of makes him a hero for me. But if you interrogate his views on foundation of the State of Israel, he was contemptuous of Zionism, and actually there was an implicit undercurrent that he had a problem with Jewish people, and that's a moderate Labour guy that was thinking that, and it was the left wingers in the party who were the friends towards Israel and the Jewish community. The other conflict that marks a major kind of seismic shift is 2003 and the Iraq War. So that's not actually a war that involves Israel, but it marks a point where, first of all, it marks the beginning of the long, slow decline of Tony Blair's wing of the party in terms of control of the Labour Party, because their credibility is shot with a lot of ordinary party members. And I think it creates this kind of mental image for people on the left of that pretty much anything that the West does in the Middle East is at the very least will go disastrously wrong, and it could actually be a kind of form of neo-imperialism, of going in and messing up a country with a large Muslim population. And they start to look at Israel for a prism really of what they're thinking about the UK. So people that don't like the UK intervening in the Middle East and have this mental image of British soldiers and American soldiers doing things that they don't find acceptable in Iraq, next time Israel is faced by conflict with either Hezbollah or Hamas, they don't look at what Israel is actually up against. They kind of think, well, I don't like people that look a bit like us, that come from a country with a similar economic and political system, acting like this. This is a rerun of Iraq, and that Israel is just bracketed with the USA and the UK in terms of countries with a, quote, bad foreign policy. During Ed Miliband's leadership, the party starts to shift from really a bipartisan consensus. So I'm guessing lots of people in this room had Jim Murphy as their MP for a long time, and felt very comfortable voting for him both on a personal level because of his stance towards the community and towards Israel, but also the party that he was a front bencher in. Really, though, you would have struggled to find a difference between Labour Party policy and Conservative Party policy towards Israel during the 97 to 2010 period. And then things begin to change a little bit under Ed Miliband, who's a kind of interesting character because he's the Labour Party's first and only so far Jewish leader. It's a big deal. He's from an extremely secular background. I mean, I don't think Ralph Miliband his father went to synagogue a lot because he was a Marxist political theorist, and I'm pretty sure he didn't take David and Ed to synagogue. So this is not someone that's a religiously observant Jew, but is culture. Yeah, he's from a family who have relatives in Israel, who have relatives who died in the Holocaust, who escaped, I think, from Belgium and escaped the Holocaust. So he's clearly he's Jewish, and he went on a kind of journey during the first 4 years of his leadership from being kind of ambivalent, not really engaging with the issue that he was Jewish. That if you're suddenly the leader of the Labour Party and you're from a Jewish background, the community, the organised community, the border deputies and the JLC and stuff, want to come and talk to you. And so that made him engage with it and become more aware of his Jewishness and more articulate about it. If you look at his leader's speeches over the years that he was leader, he talked about it more towards the end than he did at the beginning. And he was doing stuff like having the chief rabbi round to his house on a Friday evening for dinner, which sounds pretty Jewish to me. I mean, I'm sure Chief Rabbi would be an excellent dinner guest for me as a non-Jew, but I'm not sure I could provide the correct stuff in dietary terms. And all this seemed to be a very, very warm relationship was developing with the community, but with engaging with Israel as an issue as well, culminating in 2014, where Ed went with Labour Friends of Israel to Israel. He did a speech which was well received in the Knesset. There were really heartwarming pictures of him hugging his elderly, I think, great aunt on a kibbutz. It all went incredibly well. And then about a month later, Hamas kidnapped the 3 boys at the Gush Etzion junction, murders them. There's a clampdown. There's a response with rocket attacks, and then there's Israeli airstrikes. And initially, Ed Miliband doesn't call for a ceasefire. He seems to be saying, initially in that 2014 Gaza conflict, that the airstrikes are justified to get rid of the rocket attacks. And then immense pressure happens. And it happens at 2 levels. Structurally within the Labour Party. The first thing is that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is ahead of the game in terms of the use of mass email campaigns that can do a postcode search or whatever to get you to write to their MP, and they generate something near to 100,000 emails from people angry about the Gaza war to their MPs. The nature of the demographics of people that would be particularly angry about the Gaza war is that they're more likely to have Labour MPs. Yeah, this is more likely to be students, it's more likely to be people from the Muslim community that feel an affinity with people that share their religion. It's more likely to be, to stereotype, I don't know if this works in Scotland, Guardian readers, I don't know what the equivalent Scottish, but the kind of liberal left who tend to have Labour MPs, so lots of Labour MPs are going in lots of correspondence about this, and real politics shifts their position, because these are people that had only recently felt that the Labour Party was losing votes in all those key demographics to the Lib Dems after the Iraq War. It just started to get them back post the 2010 coalition. Again, some of this doesn't work in Scotland. This is we're talking about electoral patterns south of the border, but suddenly there's this fear that people if there's not a robust enough criticism of Israel, that these people are going to go back to voting for the Lib Dems, and they go and talk. The backbench MPs that feel under pressure go and talk to Ed Miliband and say, "Can you shift stance?" At the same time, there's a pressure from another segment of the Labour Party's constitution, for want of better words, which is there's a thing called the Warwick Conference, which is a meeting of the Labour Party National Policy Forum to decide its general election manifesto a year out from the general election. And I don't have a paper trail for this, I only have kind of anecdotal stuff from people that are around the process, but I'm led to believe that the Unite trade union, which has a very robust, I'm going to call it an anti-Israel policy, and has had for quite a long time. So the reason why I say it's an anti-Israel policy, they have a total boycott policy towards Israel. They won't talk to Israel, they won't formally meet Israeli trade unionists, let alone people from the Israeli government. And my understanding is that Len McCluskey or people working for him from Unite went to see, during the Warwick conference, they went and said we could put boycott into the Labour Party manifesto. They had the votes to do it, but we'll cut a deal with you, which is we won't put boycott into the Labour Party manifesto because we know you don't want that, Ed, but you've got to condemn what Israel's doing right now. And add in a third factor, which is just about Ed as a person. He's really not someone that's comfortable with military action of any time. That's just culturally not where it's coming from. There are certain politicians who like to have film of themselves in a tank, or do you remember Margaret Thatcher with the British Army of the Rhine in a Challenger tank or whatever? That isn't, Ed Miliband's not going to do that. That's not, it's not where he feels comfortable. He was very serious about things to do with defence, but it was not something that he felt uncomfortable about the use of military force, other than really as a last resort. The combination of all these factors leads him to come out and condemn the Israeli ground incursions, which were to deal with the Hamas terrorist tunnels. So this sounds like a fairly innocuous concession within the Labour Party. People are like, well, that sounds quite sort of, Labour Party people go, oh, that feels kind of balanced. But for people in the Jewish community who are kind of feeling up against it under immense pressure, a country that they care about is under rocket attack from Hamas, and there's big public demonstrations, some of which are using imagery that the community finds very frightening. The idea of a Labour Party leader deviating from two-party consensus on this and trying to tell Israel what it can and can't do to defend itself starts to break the relationship between Jewish voters and the party. I mean, obviously there's some Jewish voters that were voting Labour or SNP, or Tory or SNP or whatever anyway, but the ones who were voting Labour, like in this patch, had voted for Jim up until right through to 2010, would have started to feel uncomfortable about whether they were happy doing that with that move. Then there's a second move in the autumn of 2014, and again, I don't have a paper trail, but I believe there was pressure from Unite, which was the possibility of a debate about boycott at the Labour Party Annual Conference 2014. The leadership had the votes in those days that it could have chosen what topics got debated that are picked by local Labour parties. It didn't have control over the topics that were chosen to be debated by the trade unions. And my belief is that Unite went and said, we could put this on the agenda. You could have a situation where a boycott policy gets debated and probably gets agreed because of the agreed previous stance of a lot of the trade unions, if you don't make some other concession on this issue. And the other concession was I think it was just before conference, there was a debate in the House of Commons about unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood, which Labour whipped its MPs, but the a lot of the Labour Friends of Israel MPs broke the whip, even if they were front benchers, because it was a kind of non-binding, it was like a backbench debate that it was quite unusual to whip it anyway. Again, inside the Labour Party, this looked like a very trivial kind of shift of position, the difference between recognition of Palestine before you negotiate a two-state solution or at the end of that process. But for people in the community that really cared about Israel, it looked like the party, again, deviating from a kind of bipartisan consensus on this and giving throwing something to the Palestinian side of the debate without making any similar kind of concession or offer on the Israeli side. It looked like the kind of unilateral action that when people are, say, condemning Trump's stance on Jerusalem, people that say, oh, we shouldn't have done that, that's a unilateral move that preempts the peace talks. Well, you could say that prior recognition of a Palestinian state before peace talks is in a similar category. So things were moving. Ed Miliband did something else while he was leader. And again, Unite come into this, and Scotland comes into this time. So he reacted to this is like the wings of a butterfly flap in Latin America and a tornado happens in China or something. Eric Joyce, fine man in some regard, good, brave soldier in the Black Watch, etc., unfortunately had one pint too many in the Strangers Bar and thumped someone and had to step down as or announce that he was retiring as the MP for Falkirk, and Unite because of the remind me the name of the big plant there that they've got. Yeah. So they got loads of members there. So they went, we want this seat, and there's a scrap. Jim was involved on the other side over who's going to be the MP. It kind of compared to the infighting in the Labour Party at the moment, it looked pretty tame. And the beneficiary was Carrie Murphy, who is now Corbyn's chief of staff, or the intended beneficiary. But it reminds Ed Miliband how irritated he is by behaviour of some of the major unions, who frankly tried to bully him, and stylistically Ed Miliband is not, he's well equipped for winning intellectual debates, he's not well equipped for like a 20-stone bloke leaning across the table and threatening him about funding of elections or votes at conferences and stuff like that. That's not his style of doing politics. So he's fed up with being shoved around by this, and he brings in a change where he thinks that he's going to break the power of the unions in choosing future Labour leaders by getting rid of the electoral college where the unions and MPs have guaranteed votes, and bringing in a system where you can pay a small amount of money, for instance £3, to have a vote in a Labour Party leadership election. He sold that to the Labour Party's NEC as this would mean that normal voters, middle of the road people, the sort of people that decide the outcome of general elections by being swing voters, would be so inspired by this exercise in participatory democracy, this kind of primary, that they would rush in to sign up to vote for it, and the franchise would be transformed and you get far more rational decisions about who should be leader of the Labour Party. That is not what happened. One of the reasons that, I mean, other than that those normal people didn't spot that was, it wasn't really promoted to them, they didn't kind of realise the importance, perhaps they were uninspired by the non-Jeremy Corbyn candidates that were on offer. There was a guy who had organised the app and the email system for the Palestine Solidarity Campaign to generate 100,000 emails in the Gaza war, that shifted the Labour Party's position on that. It's a guy called Ben Soffer. He's now the Labour Party's head of digital engagement, and he's very clever. He's from a Jewish background. His dad is a Zionist, but he isn't. He went away to university and became more left-wing and critical of Israel. He was the secretary of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign before he worked for the Labour Party. He went the next summer to be the head of digital for the Jeremy Corbyn campaign. And with John Landsman, another guy from a Jewish Zionist background. John wouldn't call himself a Zionist. I actually think he probably is, because he thinks that there should be a two-state solution and that Israel should exist. But those two, and Simon Fletcher, who used to work for Ken Livingstone, they turn Jeremy Corbyn's campaign for leader from a kind of joke, from even amongst the people around Jeremy Corbyn. It was literally, Jeremy Corbyn sat there and went, I suppose it's my turn now, I suppose I've got to run, thinking that he would get 10%. And these guys who are excellent organisers and really know how to do online campaigning, turned it into him winning the leadership of the Labour Party, because they just did obvious things like slapping a big button on the front of their website saying, if you're not already able to vote, pay pay £3 here. And then there's a direct relationship between organisations that are very specifically anti-Israel and the large increase in Labour's membership. So the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was able to write to its 100,000 people on its email list that had previously campaigned for it and say, you really care about the plight of the Palestinians. There's this guy running for Labour Party leader, and he's our patron. He's the patron of the PSC. How much faster would it be to change Labour Party policy if you just click here, pay £3 and vote for Jeremy? The Stop the War Coalition, who have moved from being just against the Iraq War to being against any conflicts that Israel is involved in, has a very large mailing list and was able to write to people and say, you care about stopping Western imperialist wars in the Middle East. I'm not sure that's the exact language they'd use, but that's kind of ideologically where they're coming from. There's this guy, Jeremy Corbyn, who is our national president, I think he was, or chairman. I think one of the two, sort of chair or president of Stop the War. Click here, pay £3, join the Labour Party and vote. There are other organisations that were not orientated towards Israel that did it, but what's basically happened is that a group of people on the hard left of the Labour Party who had been a marginal force getting, say, 10% in leadership elections until then, they'd been so fed up with what was going on inside the Labour Party under Blair and Brown that they went off and tried to build a social movement around single-issue politics outside. And then they took those people they'd engaged with on the single issues and brought them into the Labour Party. And a large number of the people that they brought in, the single issue that they really, really cared about was Israel and the Palestinians. And a minority of those people brought in with them anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. So not just being anti-Israel, but using language in the way in which they were anti-Israel that echoes anti-Semitic tropes. I'll come on to that in a second. People also came in from other smaller left-wing parties like the Socialist Workers or the Greens or Tusk, what used to be militant, for most of whom it's de rigueur to be anti-Israel, to believe in boycotting Israel. In some cases, these are people that don't believe in a two-state solution. They believe in Israel not existing as a state anymore. And then you had a wider group just of kind of young idealistic people and older, maybe less idealistic people, but people who I would say are just kind of go with whatever they perceive the most left line to be, and these people would be very charming people to go to a dinner party with and want to do the right thing in the world, but if you were to say to them it's possible to be left-wing, it's possible to be progressive, and also to have a balanced view on Israel and the Palestinians, they would look at you as though you had landed from Mars, and I don't think you would get invited to their dinner parties that much thereafter, because they just perceive that very cartoonishly Israel is bad. There's one set of people, the Palestinians, that are the victims, and one set the oppressors, and the Labour Party's membership changes fundamentally, but really, what I was trying to explain earlier, there was already at a membership level a lot of criticism of Israel, a lot of people starting to look at boycotts, a lot of disengagement from Israel as an issue, but the leadership had been managing that situation and trying to maintain a consensus on it. I've already explained a bit about the trade unions moving into a more pro-boycott and anti-Israel position before this. That's partly because this kind of movement in of people from parties outside of Labour already structurally exists in the trade unions. So a trade union has to let anyone in who is not a trade union that's affiliated to the Labour Party isn't just for Labour Party members, it's for anyone that works in the industries that it represents, So in Scotland you would have loads of SNP people that would be members of trade unions, and their voices would be heard at the TUC. In England you'd have far smaller parties that were involved in the union movement, but disproportionately powerful within trade unions. So I'm thinking the Socialist Workers' Party, and any of you that were old enough to be students in the 70s and 80s will remember that the Socialist Workers' Party attitude towards Israel was to try and shut down Jewish societies on British campuses on the basis that if the Union of Jewish Students was a Zionist organisation and believed that Israel should exist, well, Zionism was inherently racist, and therefore you couldn't have Jewish societies on campus because that was a racist construct. So we're shutting... I mean, this is just so topsy-turvy that it's very difficult to explain, but that's basically where the SWP are coming from. They tell all their people to really involve themselves in detail in trade union work. And then, even more bizarrely, you have the Communist Party of Britain, the old Stalinist or tanky, because they supported the tanks going into Prague and Budapest, wing of what had been the Communist Party, who had split from it because it wasn't pro-Moscow enough. And these guys are tiny. I mean, I don't think they've got more than a couple of thousand members. When they stand in general elections, they might get a few hundred votes. But they have a lot of credibility in the trade union movement. It's because their people are very serious about industrial strife and building trade union organisation. And people from the CPB go in and get stuck into trade unions. If you were having problems with your boss and you wanted to win a strike, you'd probably be best off asking someone from the CPB to be the organiser. I'm trying to not get my C's and P's and B's in the wrong order, because there are other parties with very similar sets of initials. And where did the whole line that the SWP had parroted, Zionism is racism, where did that come from? That came from stuff that the Soviet Union pushed in the 1970s at the UN, and from propaganda that the Soviet Union had propagated once it decided that Israel wasn't going to be... There was a period of about 2 or 3 years where Stalin thought that Ben-Gurion would be his little mate in the Middle East and they would kind of outflank the West. And then when it turned out the Israelis were kind of into parliamentary democracy, he lost interest and starts reverting to traditional anti-Semitic line that Soviet communists had about rootless cosmopolitans and Zionist plots and this, that and the other, and pumps propaganda into the Arab world, particularly, tarring Israel as an inherently racist construct, trying to make out that it's in the same category as apartheid South Africa, as part of balancing power in the Cold War, basically, to keep Egypt and Syria on side, and to maintain a kind of anti-colonial narrative. So that's the political roots of the CPB. You want to know where certain people from the CPB are right now? Well, there's a guy called Seamus Milne, whose back issues of his editorials, you can find out what he believes about Israel from the Guardian website. Seamus Milne is Jeremy Corbyn's Director of Communications and Strategy. He started his... he's been in the Labour Party a long time, so I remember him being in the Labour Party in Chalk Farm when I was the local organiser there in the late 90s. But he started his political life as the circulation manager of Straight Left, the magazine of the pro-Moscow wing of the Communist Party. Who else is in Jeremy Corbyn's office? There's a guy called Andrew Murray, not the tennis player. You can look him up on YouTube to see him speaking during the 2014 Gaza conflict. He's kind of foaming at the mouth, literally, with the degree. Literally, the guy looks like he's spitting when he talks about Israel, yelling very extreme anti-Israel stuff into megaphone. Andrew Murray went from being chief of staff at the Unite Trade Union to being an advisor in Jeremy Corbyn's office, a strategist for Jeremy Corbyn. And Andrew Murray, until about 18 months ago, served on the Politburo of the Communist Party of Britain. So that's, 18 months ago he was in the little tiny Stalinist party in the UK, and now he's joined the Labour Party and is working in the leader's office. I find that all, even if it wasn't to do with the Israel issue, I'm not really keen on people that actually whitewash or fetishise the Stalin-era Soviet Union being involved in the running of a major political party. I don't think that I particularly want them there. Other micro-factions that are involved in the Socialist Action, what used to be Tariq Ali's International Marxist Group. Again, a tiny organisation, but very good, very bright people politically in terms of the way they operate. They provided all the advisors to Ken Livingstone when he was the Mayor of London. Socialist Action's line on everything international is a kind of blur. They're Trotskyists, but they kind of blur Trotskyism and Stalinism. They basically support any anti-American regime. So they love Venezuela, they love Cuba, they love whatever the most extreme positioning is they can find on Israel. They would buy into the kind of language that when people describe Hamas and Hezbollah, rather than as being the fascist organisations that they are, as being somehow part of the global left. Fourth organisation is dead, but it's important to understand its tradition, which is the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which imploded because of effectively a rape scandal around Jerry Healy, its founder. So the WRP had a kind of Labour Party entryist offshoot, which was a magazine called Labour Herald. This is in the 1980s. And it also had its own daily newspaper called Newsline, which was printed daily in colour. A tiny little revolutionary party. How did they fund the printing of this magazine inside Labour and a newspaper outside? Money from Gaddafi. Gaddafi is obsessively and anti-Semitically anti-Israel, and it's these guys that take things that the Soviets had been putting around about comparing Israel to Nazis, which is like, you know, the most obscene kind of hurtful thing that you could possibly throw at Jews, the Holocaust inversion, the implication that the people who were victims of the Holocaust are now acting like they're creating a new one, and they and the WRP and its Labour Herald offshoot in the Labour Party love this imagery. So when editors of this magazine, Labour Herald, in succession, John McDonnell, last time I checked he was Shadow Chancellor, and Ken Livingstone, the member of the Labour Party until last night. When Ken Livingstone was editor, they famously published a cartoon, and you can work out the date because it was Menachem Begin, dressed in the uniform of Reichsführer SS, dressed as Heinrich Himmler, stood on a pile of Palestinian skulls. So they love this whole make the Jews and the Israelis look like Nazis, and that imagery, sadly, on social media, modern versions of that trope are a major component of the anti-Semitism that's going on inside the Labour Party. So I want to be very clear here now. There are loads of people inside the Labour Party who are intensely critical about Israel, and they never use any of these tropes. I think you have to have a definition somewhere of what forms of anti-Zionism you consider to be anti-Semitic, and I think the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which the government has adopted, it's not perfect, but it's as good a definition as any. And I'll kind of use that to explain the forms that this that post-2015 anti-Semitism has taken inside the Labour Party. The scale of it is difficult to put a finger on. So the party says there are 70 big cases that it wants to resolve by the end of July. They're not going to manage to resolve them by the end of July unless... by the way, has that switched itself off? Or the low? But let's take their word for it that there are 70 cases that are significant. Labour Against Anti-Semitism, which is a grassroots group, has that monitors what people are doing on social media, which is where it has sent in a 4-figure number. I think sometimes I've seen it quoted as 3,000, sometimes as 1,000. Some of these might not be actual because they might be people that are being anti-Semitic, but they're not actually Labour Party members, or they're anonymous accounts and you can never track them down. But once you include the offline stuff, the online stuff, there is a lot of this. So you have some high-profile cases like Livingston that are actually in the media. You have a lot of stuff that is on Facebook and Twitter, and then you have a lot of stuff that happens in some Labour Party meetings. So there'll be some constituency party meetings where this never happens, and others where it happens at every meeting. There's an there's an obsession with debating either anti-Semitism or Israel-Palestine, and the language gets out of control, and it becomes. And I think you may end up with underreporting, because if I am a Zionist, but if I was a Jewish Zionist, I might stop going to the meetings after. Yeah, you want to go along and talk about the need for better street lighting in Newton Mends, or the Brexit policy, and you find that every damn meeting is obsessed with Israel and anti-Semitism, and all of it is, all the motions that get submitted are either hypercritical of Israel, or they're saying there isn't really a problem of anti-Semitism and it's all been cooked up. The forms that this that anti-Semitic behaviour in the Labour Party takes, a lot of it is extreme anti-Zionism. It's people that are so angry about Israel that they cross through from criticism of Israel to actually wanting it not to exist, to wanting a one-state solution, through into stuff that is actually just offensive to Jewish people. So the Holocaust inversion I've already talked about. If you make analogies between Israel and its behaviour and the Nazis, well, A, you know nothing about history, and you actually make it difficult to properly explain the history of the Shoah. But I believe that that's anti-Semitic. That's baiting Jewish people to make that comparison. Then you get inability to talk about Israel without going somewhere near stuff that looks like a blood libel. So this is a bit weird because most people aren't consciously aware that the blood libel. Jews are aware of it because of the history of Christian anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, but non-Jews tend not to be consciously aware of it. That this is the idea, the mythology from the Middle Ages of the Jews being kind of obsessed with bloodshed, of killing children, of when you see baby killers on placards at anti-Israel demos, it's getting into this territory because of slanders against Jews that were used to start pogroms about the Jews killing Christian babies for some bizarre story to do with them making a matzah bread. I mean, it's completely crazy stuff. And the problem is that people insensitively wade into this debate, not knowing much about the history of anti-Semitism. They see this being thrown around, and that imagery might not be used explicitly in the West. It is used in the Arab world. In the Arab world, there is this stuff about bloodthirsty Jews killing non-Jewish babies, etc., etc. That is that bad. That's the level of anti-Semitism that you can buy pamphlets about in the street in Cairo or in Damascus. And people use that kind of imagery, possibly without knowing where they're going. But I'll give you an example. There's a guy called Luke Cresswell, who is a councillor in South Suffolk, who I complained to the Labour Party, and he got suspended, and then he got let back in and allowed to become a councillor. During the 2014 war, he put a meme on his Twitter account, which was the flag of Israel, and then he used a typeface that looked like dripping blood. And he put the words, "Well done, Israel, Moses would be proud of you," in blood dripping down the flag. And why you would bring Moses into it, what has a prophet got to do? Yeah, that's bringing the Jewish religion and Jewishness into it, rather than nothing. Doesn't mention Netanyahu's name. He mentions Moses, and then the kind of blood imagery. Yeah, the community finds a no-no, and it should be, once people are told that that's offensive, they need to stop. And then the third and probably the most prevalent thing is conspiracy tropes. So this is stuff that comes straight out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, out of Tsarist forgeries about Jewish control of finance, business, politics, foreign policy of major states, and the kind of sometimes it just gets insinuated, and then you get stuff that's more explicit. Like anyone that mentions Rothschild, they're gone. That's like if you start banging on about I mean, I've met Lord Rothschild. I don't know why they particularly pick on him. He's like quite a nice guy that does a lot of charity work and stuff. But that family's name get dragged in and put at the centre of completely crazed conspiracy theories about Mossad is deciding the policy of the Blairite wing of the Labour Party and of the Conservative Party and the editorial line of all the newspapers. I mean, Mossad is good, but they're not. They're not that competent, and sadly, conspiracy theories are increasingly like a thing on the left. So any kind of conspiracy theory, you usually end up with throwing Jews into it. And part of the discourse that's come around in the internet age is the wide propagation of conspiracy theories about 9/11 didn't happen. All the Jewish people were told to get out of the Twin Towers on the morning of 9/11. That kind of stuff. And literally, the first one that came into my mind there's a Jewish angle on it. And to allege that kind of conspiratorial control, that's classical anti-Semitism. It gets deployed in arguing against the exploration of the other types of categories of anti-Semitism. So you will go and you will say, someone made a Nazi analogy and that's really inappropriate and disciplinary action needs to be taken. And it will be a conspiracy of Zionists, Blairites, Jews, Rothschilds, whatever else has got it in for this person just because they made a comparison about what Israel was doing. That then brings me on to other types of anti-Semitism that are not to do with anti-Zionism. I mean, almost certainly the people that propagate them are anti-Zionists. They would like to get rid of Israel. But they start banging on in the last couple of years about stuff that is not Israel-related, which is kind of interesting. Because that kills any argument that this is just people being so upset by whatever thing that they're upset that Israel has last done, that it's made them see red and they've accidentally used language that was insensitive and crosses a line into criticising Jews rather than just Israel. Because if they're starting to deploy anti-Jewish stuff that is nothing to do with Israel, it kind of tells you where some of these people on the extreme fringe of the debate are coming from. And I say extreme fringe of the debate, but these are not fringe characters in terms of the internal working of the Labour Party. So Mr Livingston, the Labour Party as of yesterday, he reacts to Naz Shah, an MP, apologising for being caught putting an anti-Semitic Facebook post up. And Naz Shah has gone and educated herself and made friends with the Jewish community in Bradford and kind of gone on a journey. Well, he comes straight out, all guns blazing, and for some reason throws into the conversation and then won't stop talking about it for 2 years, and probably won't stop talking for the rest of his life, about a conspiracy allegation that really trumps them all in its disgustingness, which is the allegation that Zionists colluded in the genocide of their own people with the Nazis. That German Zionists were so keen to get a Jewish state established in Israel that Livingston is basically alleging that they were kind of doing backroom deals with the Nazis and throwing the rest of the Jewish community under a bus. It's completely sick. It comes from one crank historian, a Trotskyist guy from America called Lenny Brenner. Every serious historian debunks it, but it doesn't stop Ken talking about it. And then he has achieved a dream result for anti-Semites. Because this weird theory that used to get 20 people in a room at Sunderland Poly listening to it when Lenny Brenner came over on a speaking tour, every idiot on the internet now goes, well, you can't say Ken Livingstone's wrong, Google the Havara Agreement. And they go to some Wikipedia page that is a load of old cobblers about this Or there's a picture of the coin, like they've dredged up a coin somewhere that's got a Star of David on one side and a swastika or whatever on the other side, and using this one artefact to try and prove their point. You get conspiracy tropes also that are about capitalism. So this is the kind of socialism of fools, Babel, who was a German social democrat, called it, which is the not analysing how does capitalism work in terms of an economic system and where does power sit in it and who holds capital and who holds labour or whatever, but capitalism's run by 4 Jewish blokes sat round a table with Lord Rothschild, like kind of exploiting the masses of the world, like personalise it and make it all Jewish. Example of this is this mural in Tower Hamlets that Jeremy Corbyn didn't condemn in 2012, and then he was confronted with this when David Collier, who I think you've heard speak here before, went and got involved in one of the Facebook groups that Jeremy had been a member of. So this is not to do with Israel or security or Zionism. This is a picture that, by the admission of the artist, some of the figures in it were intended by him to be Jewish, sat on a Monopoly board that's resting on the backs of people that look kind of a browner colour, who are the exploited of the world, and it's like a conspiracy theory that the Jews are all sat somewhere playing Monopoly with everyone else's labour. Jackie Walker, again, people are trying to dismiss Jackie as fringe. She was the vice chair of Momentum. She's the vice chair of the what's now the majority faction in the Labour Party that holds all 8 of the 9 seats in the constituency section on the Labour Party NEC, and she's a friend of Jeremy Corbyn. It must be very difficult for him, because he's having to take action against people that, when this was a 10% minority in the Labour Party and they all felt terribly beleaguered, these are the people that he would have a drink with, have dinner with, go to loads of meetings with every weekend. Jackie has mixed antecedents, Jewish on one side and Caribbean on the other side, and I can only interpret her remarks as somehow playing out some inner conflict where she kind of feels very uncomfortable about the two parts of her heritage, rather than celebrating both of them, because she throws in, this is at a training event about anti-Semitism, a Labour Party conference that the Jewish Labour movement were running. She makes the allegation that remembrance of the Holocaust never includes any other genocides, which is just factually incorrect. I mean, I'm assuming most people in the room have been involved in HMD or HET activities and know that that other genocides are looked at, and general lessons are drawn from the Shoah about, as well as an understanding of its exceptionalism. And then she makes an allegation that Jews were intrinsically involved in the funding of the slave trade. So it's almost like she's trying to start a race war where it's like, kind of let's set black people against Jews by like making out that the suffering of black people was caused by Jews. Again, this historically doesn't stand up. It's like a kind of weird conspiracy theory. The Labour Party starts to try and address this with the Chakrabarti review, which is inadequate, in my view. I was in meetings with Shami Chakrabarti twice with Jewish community leaders. I thought she understood the issues and wanted to do the right thing, and failed to, because I think she felt that had she explained the roots of left-wing anti-Semitism in extreme anti-Zionism and the Soviet bloc and stuff like that in a way in which I've touched on, it was too close to home for the people that had not sponsored her, that had commissioned her to write the report. The launch of that is disrupted by Mr. Wadsworth, who was expelled from the Labour Party a couple of months ago, who uses the launch of a report into anti-Semitism to accuse Ruth Smead, Jewish Labour MP, of being part of a conspiracy with the media. People get a theme emerging here. Jeremy Corbyn, in his speech, very, very subtle, but he says we should know something along the lines of, we should know, and you can go away and Google it. I wrote, if you look up Luke Akehurst Chakrabarti report on Google, you can find the exact words, because I put it in an article I wrote that evening. where he says something like, we should no more hold our Jewish friends accountable for the actions of the State of Israel than we hold our Muslim friends accountable for the actions of certain so-called Islamic states, I think he said, or entities. So, do you get what he's doing there? He might deny. I think this is a guy saying, "Oh, I've just signed a thing that says that we can't make analogies with the Nazis. In the speech I do, welcoming that, I'm going to make an analogy with the most hateful force that's on the planet at the moment, which is comparing the IDF to ISIS in a deliberately opaque way, but a dog whistle way." And as for Chakrabarti accepting period, I mean, it's like if you are commissioned to write an independent report, it is not a good look to then accept the only peerage given out in a 2-year period by the organisation that commissioned you to write the independent report. It's like, I think she feels very conflicted about it all, but she had the opportunity to deal with this and didn't. I'm getting near to the end because I realise I've been talking for quite a long time, but I think it's important. I'm guessing everyone in the room, sadly, has had to engage with the skidding across the superficiality of this, so it's important to give the opportunity to give you more of the detail of how it all fits together. The Jewish Labour Movement campaigns very, very hard and achieves a victory, which is at last year's Labour Party conference to get, for the first time, a rule change that says you can specifically have disciplinary action taken for being anti-Semitic and for a range of other prejudices against other protected characteristics, when before you could only really have action taken if you damaged the party, not if you damaged one of the other members of the party. It was a huge achievement to get that through. We didn't have the votes to get it through, though. The moderates in the Labour Party or the allies of the JLM didn't have the votes to get it through. We actually got it through because of the ambiguous, but in this case very positive, role of John Lanterman. So I'd say ambiguous because he's the guy that created Momentum, and Momentum gave a huge organisational voice in the Labour Party, initially to people like Jackie Walker that they're now trying to distance themselves from. But John did the right thing on the rule change. He got all the Momentum delegates who were prepared to follow his line to vote the right way, and he took, you could see from the balcony of the conference, him taking McCluskey to one side and persuading McCluskey, who had been at the launch of a anti-Zionist group, Jewish Voice for Labour, to get Unite to vote in favour of the leadership's rule change. But a price was paid in terms of the optics. So you get the rule change, you get the substantive change, but the other optics of the conference are awful. It's really, really horrible for anyone that cares about this issue. So during the debate, Claudia Webb, member of the Labour Party's NEC in the chair, calls people that I find it difficult to believe, having chaired Labour Party conference twice, that she didn't know who was sat where, because you have a grid that shows you who's sat where. It's not a complete accident. You have an idea. You have a chair's aide that's telling you who's out there in the audience. She calls two leading lights in JVL, Leah Levine from Hastings and Naomi Wimborne-Indressy from Chingford, who do raving anti-Zionist speeches about if this rule change gets fit, it's all because of conspiracy of Blairites and Zionists. Again, I think we see a theme emerging, a conspiracy involving the media, all designed to do. So there's the Livingston formulation, which the Livingston formulation is that you accuse anyone that says there's anti-Semitism of acting in bad faith for political motives. So, it's all people trying to do down Jeremy Corbyn, and the same people that vote for the rule change stand up and give standing ovations to those people. And there's a launch meeting for Jewish Voice for Labour, which is a blatant attempt to undermine the Jewish Labour movement, what was Pearl Zion, as being the official Jewish affiliate of the Labour Party, to provide a kind of kosherized voice of that people can turn around and say, oh well, I'm definitely not being anti-Semitic in the extreme language I use, because here is this bunch of people that A, are just as anti-Israel as I am, and B, say that there isn't really a problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and these people are Jewish, and therefore I'm allowed to carry on saying whatever I want to say. Len McCluskey went to their launch meeting and kind of endorsed it. Outside the conference, you have an even tinier organisation, the Labour Party Marxists, which literally consists of a bloke called Stan Keeble from Hammersmith Labour Party, handing out an extremely well-produced magazine, which includes an article by Professor Moish Makova, a former Israeli communist, which approvingly, to stand up stuff around Livingston and this Havar agreement, quotes approvingly words from I'm trying to remember which of the guy it was someone that had been at the Wannsee conference, that it quotes a leading Nazi as saying, oh, Zionism's a great thing, kind of thing, you know, in order to try and prove that there's this collusion. It's a bizarre situation where you've got an ex-communist handing, and a group calling themselves the Labour Party Marxists handing out leaflets that pray in aid to their argument, the wording of someone that was actually instrumental in the final solution. Since then, this whole kind of finding little groups of Jews that you can use to undermine mainstream communal opinion has become a bigger and bigger thing. So you have the promotion of JVL as though that is an equivalent voice to the JLM when it's minuscule. And somehow saying that the Jewish labour movement, because it's Zionist, is like they're unrepresentative and bad, and this JVL is the real voice of Jewish people in the Labour Party when it's got, like, I don't know, 20 people in it. And there's an interesting little chart that shows how all of the key players in it, the chair, the secretary, treasurer, etc., also chair, secretary and treasurer of a bunch of other organisations, both inside and outside the Labour Party, starting with one called Free Speech on Israel. Free Speech on Israel is basically arguing that the IRA definition is bad because it's freedom of speech to be able to compare Israelis to Nazis and to have conspiracy tropes, etc., etc. Corbyn, in the last few month or so, where we've had the enough is enough debate, enough is enough protest, part of his response to that, he invites mainstream communal organisations to meet him, and then he says they're having a round table the next day where he was going to put JVL and all these little fringe organisations as though they were sat around the table with, I don't know, the CST and UJIA and the major and the board and the JLM as though they are equivalent value to them. There's the very clever move of attending the Judas Seder. So this isn't a proper Seder, it's the third Seder, which is, I think, something that emerged in very left-wing Yiddish circles in New York in the 20s or 30s. The idea that you have a third night of the same kind of discussion, you have a Seder about contemporary politics. And Jeremy pitches up to that, and it calls it, and it's the only kind of, he could have gone to anything to do with Pesach. He could have found very, very left-wing sets of Jews who would have caused less offence than if anyone's read the script for the thing. If you can look at it from one direction, and it's hilariously funny because the whole point of Judas is it's a kind of performance art and kind of anarchistic cocking a snook at the authorities, and from another angle, it's like deliberately mocking a religious service. But I think that Jeremy and people around him are so far gone on all this that they believe their own propaganda, that when they're talking to these very, very fringe groups of Jewish people who are anti-Zionist, so they're part of the 7% of the Jewish community that are anti-Zionist, and in some cases deny that there's an anti-Semitism problem in the Labour Party. I'm going to qualify this because the Judas people don't deny that. So the Judas people, A, are religiously observant, unlike a lot of the... So there are some other guys that just kind of their background is Jewish, but they kind of only really talk about being Jewish when they're having a go at Israel, or they're saying there's no problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The Judas people do accept that there's a problem with anti-Semitism, and they actually produce quite good stuff on how to be left-wing and to oppose it, but they are anti-Zionist on the whole, most of them are. But I think he goes along and he actually thinks, oh, this fun, great group... I don't think Jeremy Corbyn's got a problem with Jewish people. I think he rather enjoyed going to the Judas Seder, but he, in his head, rather than being like 30 people in an upstairs room in Islington, he thinks that like there's several denominations in Judaism. There's like the United Synagogue and Orthodoxy, and then there's Reform and Masorti and Liberal, and then there's Judas. And there's like the Judas is probably like as big as the United Synagogue, and like in the same way that they think that because all the Jewish people they meet really hate Israel, they think that JVL is of equivalent size and status and standing in the community to the JLM, and it's only like very rich kind of Tory donor bigwig Jews that are coming and telling them that they shouldn't call Israel Nazis, etc. Two final points. Well, actually, let's just remember another awful thing that happened in the last couple of months was Christine Shawcroft. I have to confess I have a slight personal animus towards Christine Shawcroft. I get on, or try to get on well, with people from all wings of politics, even when I vigorously disagree with them. I try to be personally friendly with them. It is quite difficult to get on well with someone who wrote in a magazine article, wouldn't write my name, and wrote, "That creature from Hackney." What else did she call me? There was something, it wasn't maggot, there was something really bizarre. That she's got a choice way with words. She had to step down as the chair of the Labour Party NEC Disputes Committee. So as part of the hard left moving through all the Labour Party structures and taking them over, they installed her to chair the hearings about people that had been accused of anti-Semitism. Within about 1 week of being installed as that, she writes to the officers in charge of the cases, intervening on behalf of someone the details of whose case she hasn't read, but she is a political ally of hers, to get him off the hook and allow him to be a council candidate in Peterborough. What had the guy actually done? He had posted like a Holocaust denial image, like mocking the gates of Auschwitz on his Facebook page. And she was just like, oh, but he's a good bloke who knocks doors a lot and we should let him run in Peterborough. That's kind of how far it had gone. On the specifics of the anti-Semitism, Livingston's resignation, I think they think that is a clever move to wriggle out, to not have him any conviction, for him to go like with the full honours of an honourable handing in of his sword, of Jeremy saying he was sad about it, sad about it, not saying that it was deplorable and it's an example of zero tolerance that he can't stay in, but he was sad about it. He gets away without the ignominy of the hearing. They don't have to be seen to take the action. They can turn around to the JLC and the Board of Deputies and say, we couldn't take the action because he's not a Labour Party member anymore. And I believe there may be more similar tactics coming from other people. So this is, I don't think that this ends it. I think the penny is dropping in the electoral consequences. I think Barnet, they literally thought that they could treat the Jewish voters with contempt, that somehow this was a minority concern amongst the Jewish community that was just being shouted about by people that were already their political opponents. And the Barnet Council election results showed both that the Jewish community and its neighbours, people that knew and cared about the opinions of the Jewish community, that there was an electoral consequence for not dealing with this. And the tragedy for the Corbyn people is they could have accelerated Livingstone's case and removed him from the party before the local elections, and it would have sent a signal to Jewish voters there that at least some action was being taken. And they chose not to because they thought they could brush it all under the carpet and deal with it later during the summer, and it would somehow become a bigger issue if there was an expulsion. Well, the issue became big because the Jewish community rightly said enough is enough. I finally want to end just by circling back to what on earth is going on with the policy on Israel, because this is the bizarre thing is there's been all this heat and noise around anti-Semitism and very little movement on the issue of Israel, which I think people assumed would be one of the first iconic policies that would change when Jeremy became leader, because it's something that is central to his identity. Yet they talk rather grandiosely about him having been the shadow foreign secretary of the left. They talk about which basically means the bloke that specialised in Cuba, Venezuela, Israel, not very many other places, and did stump speeches about it every weekend round the country. He really is an issue that he cared about as a backbencher. But the Labour Party's policy is almost identically word for word what it was in 2015. So no boycotts and a two-state solution. My fear is that at some point there will be a kind of revenge. It'll be like we've had to make concessions, we've had to lose these dear comrades that we care so much about with their wonderful record, like Mr. Livingstone and Mr. Wadsworth, and therefore we're going to shift the Israel policy to show that we're not being pushed around by the Zionists. And the two things I think that would be very easy to do, I think, would be a settlement BDS policy. If that got to the conference floor at the Labour Party conference, it would pass very, very easily. And I think there are people inside the community that don't buy settlement goods as well. There's a live debate about that. But it's the thin end of the wedge, because if you have a settlement boycott, you're saying boycott is an acceptable tactic to use towards Israel, at least on a narrow level, so why a broader level becomes morally more acceptable. And you start to look at things like there's a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Male Adumim, so that's no Coke products at the Labour Party conference. Seriously, that's the NUS tried to stop having Coke products in every student union bar in Britain because of this, and then backed off from it, or were defeated on it. And you start to look at which institutions trade in the settlements. Oh, all the Israeli banks do, so we can't do any business with them. Loads of Israeli house builders or whatever do, so we can't do any business with them. Israeli academic institutions might have a branch in a settlement. The Israeli government has facilities in settlements, so we can't do any business. And you end up with what looks like a narrow boycott becomes a far broader one. And then the second thing is arms embargo, which is being very much talked about because of the events in Gaza last Monday, and would be very easy for the Labour Party to shift position on, because it already has a policy of arms embargo of Saudi Arabia. So if you're happy not to sell British arms to Saudi Arabia because of Yemen, when the economy of the northwest of England depends on the BAE Systems Eurofighter factories in the northwest, and you have two major trade unions who have large numbers of hundreds of thousands of people that work for BAE Systems, an arms embargo of Israel is quite easy, because the trade is actually mainly in the other direction. The British Armed Forces buy drones and some electronic warfare stuff off the Israelis. We don't sell very much to the Israelis because, and this is where I, as a Labour guy, I get to restore some honour and show that it's not all one-way traffic. Ted Heath let the Israelis down very badly in the Yom Kippur War by refusing to resupply stuff for Centurion tanks. So that at that point, that's when the IDF decided that after Ted Heath that the British were not good suppliers on defence stuff and became very much able to do things indigenously or from the Americans. But I am afraid that there is a significant risk of those major policy changes, and I am afraid that whilst the the top of the chain of the anti-Semitic stuff, the propagators of some of this action or has been taken, or rather they've taken action against themselves. During the 2 years, they've got all these horrible concepts, these conspiracy theory concepts, blood libel concepts, Nazi analogy concepts, allegations of collusion between Nazis and Zionists, and they've got them out there and popularised them so that very large numbers of people know about them, think they're okay, indeed think they're okay because it's Ken Livingstone that has talked about them, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to eradicate that. On that thoroughly depressing note, which is awful to have to give such a downbeat talk on a sunny evening, I think we should stop and maybe say goodbye to anyone that was watching on the live stream, and we'll go over to Q&A.